You know, every time I uncover something new about a popular religious belief or some sort of spiritual fraternity that exposes itself for just how fraudulent it truly is, I begin to smile. I smile because it pleases me for a few reasons. The first reason is because it proves how so many human beings are comparable to sheep. Sheep that you can do anything to. It also pleases me because it further proves how you can shatter one's world with a revelation that brings a negative light to what they cherish the most. Finally, by tearing down and decimating all spiritual beliefs by first exposing how fraudulent they are and how many are just derivative of another, we begin as a world to move another step closer towards a new one-world religion. This movement didn't start with me, and this idea didn't originate with me, but I am doing all I can to push mankind towards this, as I will continue to break down all beliefs one by one until the man of sin is revealed. Now, let me begin. Ibn Khaldun, born on May 27, 1332 in Tunis, Tunisia, and died on March 17, 1406 in Cairo, Egypt, was a significant Arab historian and philosopher. He is known for developing one of the earliest non-religious philosophies of history, encapsulated in his masterpiece, the Muqaddimah, or Introduction. The Muqaddimah is recognized as a fundamental work in the philosophy of history, sociology, ethnography, and economics. His family claimed descent from a South Arabian lineage and had moved to Spain during the early years of the Arab conquest. The family played an important role in the civil wars of 9th century Spain and held high administrative and political posts under various dynasties. When the Christian reconquest of Spain intensified, they relocated to North Africa and Tunis. The family continued to occupy significant administrative positions. The Muqaddimah was written after Ibn Khaldun sought refuge from political life in 1375. He wanted to write a universal history of the Arabs and Berbers, but felt the need to first establish criteria for distinguishing historical truth from falsehood. This led him to develop what he considered a new science, the science of culture, dealing with the nature of society and social change. His works contain profound insights into economics, politics, and education, unified by the concept of asabiya, or social cohesion, which he identified as the driving force behind the rise and decline of dynasties. Ibn Khaldun's approach and concepts were influenced by Islamic theology and philosophy, particularly Averroism. Although he drew on historical information from his predecessors, his insights into social phenomena were remarkably original for his time. His philosophy of history saw it as an endless cycle of rise and decline, with no inherent evolution or progress except a transition from primitive to civilized society. Ibn Khaldun lived through significant historical changes, including the Black Death and the Mongol invasions, and he recognized these as turning points in history. Now, despite all of this wonderful information, he described blacks in sub-Saharan Africa as natural slaves. Here is a quote from one of his books that he wrote during his time here on earth. He said, quote, "The Negro nations are, as a rule, submissive to slavery because Negroes have little that is human and possess attributes that are quite similar to those of dumb animals." Ibn Khaldun, passing away in 1406 in Cairo, was not part of what is traditionally referred to as the Golden Age of Islam, which is usually dated from the 8th to the 14th century. Instead, he lived just after this period in the late medieval period of the Islamic world. Despite this, Ibn Khaldun's contributions were profoundly influential and can be appreciated as echoing the intellectual spirit that characterized the Golden Age. While Ibn Khaldun's work did not have an immediate impact on the development of Muslim thought, it greatly impressed European intellectuals from the 19th century onwards, leading some to regard him as a forerunner of sociology and modern historiography. The central concept in his work, asabiya, otherwise known as group solidarity, is a key to understanding the rise and fall of states and was a novel approach to the study of the history and dynamics of societies. It also doesn't stop there. The Prophet Muhammad, who is beloved and respected by all those who practice Islam, also bought, owned, and traded slaves. Historical records in Islamic texts indicate that the Prophet Muhammad had male and female slaves. Islamic texts document instances of Muhammad and his companions owning and dealing with slaves. The Prophet Muhammad is known to have had concubines, including Maria, who was sent as a gift from the Byzantine ruler of Alexandria, and Rayhana. Some sources indicate that Muhammad later freed and married these women, but other sources contest this. The Hadith and other Islamic writings also detail instances where Muhammad and his companions owned slaves and engaged in the buying, selling, and gifting of slaves. It is documented that Muhammad's tribe, as well as the Sahaba, his companions, had slaves and engaged in sexual relations with female captives. The Prophet Muhammad would also take captives from wars and battles he fought and distribute them as slaves to his fellow companions. The practice of slavery in Islamic society, as documented in historical Islamic texts, include a range of regulations on dealing with slaves. This includes laws pertaining to the sale, treatment, and conditions of slavery. Slavery was an intrinsic part of society during Muhammad's life and continued in various forms in Islamic history. Slavery existed long before Islam was ever created, but instead of being the peaceful religion it is and refusing to participate in slavery, Islam adopted it and made lives for many others significantly worse. The Prophet Muhammad was also one who thought less of those who were black. These are his very words. The history of the Arab slave trade, also known as the Arab-Muslim slave trade, offers a complex and multifaceted view of slavery in the Muslim world. It began with practices inherited from pre-Islamic Arabia and developed differently across various Muslim states due to social, political, and economic factors. Islam encouraged the manumission of Muslim slaves to expiate sins, yet it never banned the practice, allowing it to persist as a significant institution. Notable early converts to Islam, such as Bilal, were former slaves. The roles of slaves in Muslim societies were diverse, ranging from powerful emirs to harshly treated laborers. The Arab slave trade was most active in West Asia, North Africa, and Southeast Africa. Estimates suggest that between 4 million to 10 million black Africans were enslaved in the 12th centuries before the 20th century. The Ottoman slave trade sourced slaves from Eastern and Central Europe and the Caucasus, while slave traders from the Barbary coast raided the Mediterranean coast of Europe. The Trans-Saharan slave trade, a crucial part of the Arab slave trade, involved transporting slaves from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa and selling them to Mediterranean and Middle Eastern civilizations. This trade was managed primarily by Arabs, with significant involvement from Berbers. Historical records indicate slave trading and transportation in the Sahara dating back to the 3rd millennium BC, with the ancient Egyptians and Nubians participating in these practices. The Garamantes, an ancient civilization, heavily relied on slave labor from sub-Saharan Africa for constructing and maintaining underground irrigation systems. Estimates suggest that 6 to 10 million black slaves were moved from sub-Saharan Africa to the Arab world, with around 7.2 million crossing the Sahara from the mid-7th century until the 20th century. The Arab slave trade was marked by extreme violence, including systematic castration of male slaves and the capture and deportation of African women and girls for use as sex slaves. This brutal practice resulted in a high death rate. Historians estimate that the Arab slave trade affected more than 17 million people, with over 9 million African captives deported from the Saharan region and 2 million dying on the routes. Slaves were sold in markets across Cairo, Baghdad, Istanbul, Mecca, and other centers, serving various roles in the Muslim world's economy. Ill treatment of slaves sometimes led to rebellions, such as the revolt of the Zanj near Basra, Iraq in 869, which lasted 15 years. From 1800 to 1890, it is thought that 25,000 to 50,000 Bantu slaves were sold from the slave market of Zanzibar to the Somali coast. These slaves were from various ethnic groups in Tanzania, Mozambique, and Malawi. In Ethiopia, there was a high demand for non-Muslim slaves, with enslaved Ethiopians working in various roles, from domestic servants to business managers for rich merchants. The Portuguese, arriving in East Africa in the late 15th century, initially disrupted but eventually participated in this trade, especially after the British Empire began restricting the transatlantic slave trade. The impact of the Arab slave trade on African societies was profound, leading to significant devastation and depopulation in some areas. This trade also contributed to the development of racialist and essentialist theories viewing blacks as inferior. Although slavery was gradually outlawed and suppressed in Muslim states in the early 20th century, its legacy persists, raising critical questions about commemoration and historical acknowledgement. The experiences of African slaves during the Islamic slave trade were harrowing and characterized by severe hardships and inhumane treatment. The conditions and experiences varied depending on the region, the period, and the roles in which the slaves were employed. Brutal capture and transport. The process of enslavement often began with violent raids and warfare in African villages. Captives were bound and forced to march long distances to slave markets, a journey during which many died due to harsh conditions, malnutrition, and abuse. The trans-Saharan slave trade, for example, involved a perilous trek across the desert where many slaves perished from exhaustion, thirst, or disease. Castration and sexual exploitation. Male slaves, especially those transported to the Middle East, often underwent castration, a practice with a high mortality rate due to unsanitary conditions and lack of medical knowledge. This practice was driven by the demand for eunuchs, who served in various capacities, including as guards in harems. Female slaves, meanwhile, were often subjected to sexual exploitation and served as concubines. The children born to these slave women were typically raised as Muslims and could integrate into society in various roles. Labor and military service. Many slaves were put to hard labor in fields, mines, and construction projects. Conditions were generally harsh, with little regard for the well-being of slaves. Some African slaves were also used in military service. For instance, the Mamluks of Egypt started as a slave corps before rising to power. These slaves often received military training and could achieve significant status, but their lives were still marked by the constraints of servitude, domestic servitude, and administration. A portion of the slaves were employed in domestic servitude, working in the homes of the wealthy. While some of these slaves might have lived relatively better lives, their freedom was still severely restricted. Some were employed in administrative roles where they could gain considerable influence, though this was not the norm. If you want to make sure that a male never feels manly again, take away his manhood. This is exactly what happened to many blacks and also some European males during the Ottoman Empire. During the Ottoman Empire, the practice of castrating slaves, particularly to create eunuchs, was both brutal and significant in its social implications. Black eunuchs, often captured from African regions such as Darfur, Abyssinia, and Zanzibar, were brought to serve in the courts of sultans in Turkey and other Middle Eastern countries. The process of castration was horrific and carried out without anesthesia, involving the cutting off of the genitals and the use of hot coals to stop bleeding, resulting in high mortality rates. The survivors, however, could achieve a life of considerable influence and luxury, often wearing silk garments and adorned with jewels, reflecting the status of their wealthy masters. The roles of these eunuchs were diverse. They served as guards and caretakers of mosques and administrators and had significant influence within the palace. The chief black eunuch in particular held immense power, carrying out missions for the sultan and being involved in various administrative and religious tasks. Their authority allowed them to amass wealth, though upon their death, their possessions reverted to the sultan as they had no heirs. In the Ottoman court, black eunuchs primarily served as guardians of the harem where the sultan's wives and concubines resided. Their castration was seen as a means to ensure their safe presence around the women, as they could not procreate. Despite their status as slaves, these eunuchs could attain substantial power and influence. The chief black eunuch, for example, held immense authority, overseeing the harem, managing its affairs, and playing a crucial role in court politics. They often lived in relative luxury compared to other slaves, amassing wealth and owning property. However, their elevated status was paradoxical as they remained socially marginalized and viewed as slaves. Interestingly, black eunuchs gained prominence towards the end of the 16th century, replacing the previously dominant white eunuchs. This shift was attributed to the fact that white eunuchs, often from Christian populations of the Balkans and the Caucasus, had family connections that could rival the Sultan's power. In contrast, African eunuchs were completely cut off from their families, creating a more direct and dependent relationship with the Sultan. The castration procedures themselves were extremely risky, with death rates in the process as high as 90%. The distinction between black and white eunuchs also lay in the method of castration. White eunuchs had only their testicles removed, whereas for black eunuchs, the entire genitalia were removed. The difference in procedure led to the eunuch factories in places like Ethiopia, where these operations were carried out. Despite the high mortality rate, those who survived the castration process and demonstrated particular skills or talents could rise to significant positions within the Ottoman court. The practice of castration and the use of eunuchs were one of the many customs the Ottomans inherited and adapted from the Byzantine Empire. The system, while allowing some eunuchs to amass power and wealth, was still fundamentally brutal and inhumane, with eunuchs remaining slaves under the Sultan despite their elevated status. As the Ottoman Empire modernized and moved towards abolition, the role and perception of eunuchs shifted significantly. The practice began to be viewed as an embarrassing relic of the past, reflecting a period of history that was increasingly seen as backward by contemporary standards. The presence of slavery in regions where Islam spread is a historical reality, and it's crucial to contextualize this within the broader historical practice of slavery, which was not exclusive to any one culture or religion. Slavery was a well-established institution in many societies long before the advent of Islam. When Islam emerged in the 7th century in the Arabian Peninsula, slavery was already a part of the social and economic systems in the region and beyond. Slavery existed in pre-Islamic societies in Arabia and was incorporated into Islamic society. The Islamic scriptures, including the Quran and the Hadiths, acknowledge the existence of slavery. As Islamic empires expanded, they encountered and often continued existing systems of slavery. Slaves in Islamic lands were used for various purposes, including labor, military service, administration, and domestic work. Slaves in Islamic societies came from various regions, including Africa, Europe, and Asia, reflecting the wide reach of Islamic empires and their trade networks. Islamic law, otherwise known as Sharia law, regulated the treatment of slaves and encouraged their manumission, especially for those who converted to Islam. However, it did not abolish the institution of slavery outright. The abolition of slavery in Islamic countries was a gradual process that took place over many years, culminating in the final abolitions in the 20th century. Among the last countries to end Islamic slavery were Saudi Arabia and Yemen, both of which abolished slavery in 1962. Oman followed suit, abolishing slavery in 1970. However, Mauritania was the last state to officially abolish slavery, doing so in 1981. Despite these formal abolitions, it's important to note that instances of slavery or slavery-like conditions have persisted in some of these regions to this very day. The path to abolition in these countries was influenced by a mix of internal reform movements and external pressures, particularly from Western nations. There wasn't an Islamic shift in attitudes toward human rights, but rather they simply didn't want to face possible increasingly intense pushback from Western nations. Islamic slave trading existed before Western nations got involved and was still ongoing after Western nations relieved themselves from slavery practices. The Islamic slave trade was also much more cruel and oppressive towards slaves than what slaves endured during the Transatlantic slave trade. Sex trafficking was also much higher. Castration was much more common. Children were usually preferred rather than grown adult males and females. Non-Muslims were also targets as well, and they especially hated Christians. Islam has never been a peaceful religion, ever. It truly has a much more gruesome history than that of the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery in America. You could also argue that it was much worse than the Catholic Crusades, but then again, that's like comparing apples and oranges. Comparing the impact of slavery in the Islamic world to that of the Crusades is challenging because they are fundamentally different phenomena with distinct contexts, motivations, and consequences. Both had significant and often devastating impacts, but they operated in different spheres, slavery being a socio-economic system and the Crusades being a series of religious and military campaigns. However, that fact still doesn't take away from the point I've made in this entire video, which is that Islam is not, nor has it ever been, nor will it ever be a peaceful religion. Have you ever noticed how many Muslims love to compare Jesus Christ and the Prophet Muhammad? As a Luciferian, I can tell you that this is a ridiculous argument. Who was more violent? Who was more peaceful? Who profited from slavery? Who spoke against and rebuked bondage? Who truly lived holy? Who had a form of godliness yet denied its power? Well, it should be obvious. Those of you who are black and practice Islam may be wondering what spiritual practice can you participate in, since Islam has a documented history of extorting, persecuting, afflicting, enslaving, castrating, sex trafficking, humiliating, emasculating, and even raping all those who look like you, who look like me. Well, choices are yours to make. I'm not here to help you make that choice. I'm here to give you all the facts. What you've all seen in this video are facts. To those of you who are white, many of you do not practice Islam anyways, and I do not recommend that you begin. Stay where you're at for now.
Lot of haters, tell me where they